The greatest deception of the modern financial era is the illusion of domestic security. The working class has been indoctrinated to believe that their capital is safe simply because it sits inside a local bank insured by the very government that is rapidly devaluing the currency. You must understand that the visible economy is not a marketplace, it is a highly sophisticated extraction grid. Every time you deposit your capital into a traditional retail bank, you are legally surrendering your ownership and becoming an unsecured creditor to an institution that leverages your life savings to enrich its executives. When the systemic collapse inevitably arrives and the banks enforce bail-ins, your domestic accounts will be frozen, your withdrawals will be restricted, and your wealth will be sacrificed to save the failing matrix. The 0.1% do not participate in this suicidal system. We recognize that true financial sovereignty can never be achieved within the borders of a single nation-state. To become mathematically untouchable by litigators, tax authorities, and desperate governments, you must step outside the visible grid and enter the offshore matrix. Today I'm going to reveal the exact geographical and legal architecture utilized by ancient family offices to render their wealth completely invisible. I will show you how to sever the digital chains of the domestic banking system and establish an impenetrable fortress in jurisdictions that categorically refuse to recognize foreign court orders. Before we decode the coordinates of the offshore matrix, you must prove that you are ready to unplug from the system of financial slavery. Subscribe to Ironclad Legacy and drop a like on this transmission right now to secure your frequency. Share this intelligence with one person in your inner circle who still blindly trusts their local bank manager. And finally, leave a comment below with a complete descriptive sentence explaining exactly why you refuse to leave your capital trapped in the domestic banking system. Do not leave a single word, write your true intent so the algorithm recognizes a human separating from the herd. Let us begin the extraction protocol. The foundation of the offshore matrix relies on a concept known as jurisdictional arbitrage. The amateur investor views the globe as a collection of countries with different cultures and languages. The apex predator views the globe as a menu of competing legal frameworks. We understand that governments are essentially service providers, and if a government provides terrible service in the form of high taxes, capital controls, and frivolous litigation, we simply fire that government and move our capital to a superior provider. The domestic investor is a prisoner of geography. If a local judge signs a piece of paper freezing your assets, the local bank complies immediately because they operate under the same sovereign flag. But when you move your capital into the offshore matrix, you introduce an insurmountable legal void between your wealth and your adversaries. Consider the architecture of an international asset protection trust domiciled in the Cook Islands or the Federation of St. Kitts and Nevis. These sovereign nations have built their entire macroeconomic survival on the absolute protection of foreign capital. Their legal statutes are specifically engineered to be explicitly hostile to foreign litigators. If a desperate creditor or a domestic government agency attempts to seize the assets held within a Cook Islands trust, they cannot simply fax a court order to the offshore trustee. The offshore jurisdiction does not recognize the authority of your domestic judge. The litigator is forced to travel across the world, hire local legal counsel, which is legally prohibited from working on a contingency fee basis, and retry the entire case from scratch under a legal system that is fundamentally designed to protect the defendant. Furthermore, they must prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the transfer of funds into the trust was explicitly designed to defraud them specifically, and they must do so within an impossibly tight statute of limitations. By the time the litigator realizes the sheer mathematical impossibility of piercing this fortress, the legal fees alone will bankrupt them, and they will be forced to abandon the pursuit. But the trust is merely the vault. To actively operate within the global economy, you must deploy the operational arms of the matrix, which are offshore limited liability companies. We do not hold the active bank accounts directly in the name of the trust, because that creates unnecessary administrative friction. Instead, the Irrevocable Trust wholly owns a limited liability company registered in a tax-neutral jurisdiction like Nevis or Wyoming. This LLC acts as the aggressive operational vehicle. It holds the international brokerage accounts, it executes the private equity acquisitions, and it acquires the physical commodities. Because the LLC is entirely owned by the offshore trust, the legal protection flows downward, completely insulating the active capital from any localized threats. You act solely as the investment advisor or the manager of the LLC. You control the movement of the capital, you dictate the acquisition strategy, but you legally own nothing. If a malicious entity attempts to sue you personally, they will find that you are entirely impoverished on paper. If they attempt to attack the LLC, they will hit the impenetrable wall of the offshore trust. This multi-layered architecture ensures that even if one layer of the matrix is somehow compromised, the core capital remains perfectly insulated and highly mobile. The true power of the offshore matrix is not simply defense. It is the unparalleled offensive capability it provides during an economic depression. When the fiat currency collapses and the domestic credit markets freeze, the retail investors are trapped in a burning building with no exits. They cannot move their capital because the government has instituted emergency capital controls to prevent bank runs. But the capital residing in the offshore matrix flows like water. You operate international bank accounts in jurisdictions like Switzerland, Singapore, or Liechtenstein, institutions that require massive minimum deposits and do not lend your capital out to subprime retail borrowers. These private banks offer multi-currency accounts, allowing you to instantly convert your wealth out of a failing fiat currency and into appreciating commodities or stable foreign reserves with the click of a button, while the middle class is begging the government for access to their own money. You are deploying your offshore liquidity to acquire the distressed assets of the visible economy, completely undetected by the collapsing system surrounding you. The execution of this offshore architecture requires absolute operational discipline. The amateur believes that once the offshore trust is established, they can simply wire funds back and forth to their domestic retail bank account without consequence. This is a fatal error that completely compromises the integrity of the matrix. Every wire transfer that touches the domestic banking system leaves a permanent digital footprint on the central ledger, alerting the tax authorities to the existence of your international structure. To maintain absolute invisibility, the family office operates entirely within a closed financial loop. When we need to access our offshore liquidity for personal consumption, we do not repatriate the funds. We utilize anonymous corporate debit cards issued by our private international banks. These cards are tied directly to the offshore limited liability company, not to your physical identity. When you purchase groceries, fuel, or international flights, the transaction is recorded under the corporate entity, entirely bypassing your personal domestic credit profile. The state cannot track your location, your consumption habits, or your standard of living because your physical identity has been mathematically decoupled from your purchasing power. This level of transactional anonymity is about to become the single most valuable asset on Earth as the central banks finalize the implementation of their central bank digital currencies. The programmable token is not merely a new form of money, it is a digital surveillance weapon designed to enforce total compliance. If your carbon footprint exceeds the mandated quota, or if your political affiliations contradict the state narrative, your domestic digital wallet will be instantly throttled. But the offshore matrix operates on an entirely different frequency. Private international banks deal in hard currencies, precious metals, and decentralized digital assets that the domestic government has absolutely no jurisdiction over. While the visible masses are trapped in a localized digital cage begging the state for an increase in their token allowance, the apex predator is freely transacting across borders, utilizing the immense liquidity of the shadow banking system. But building this matrix requires a profound psychological shift. You must accept the reality of permanent isolation. You cannot boast about your offshore structures to your peers, and you cannot flaunt your invisible wealth on social media platforms. The moment you seek public validation, you paint a massive target on your back and invite the parasitic elements of society to test the strength of your legal fortress. True power is perfectly silent. You must walk through the collapsing visible economy, appearing as just another struggling participant, while secretly controlling a global infrastructure of unassailable wealth. The financial elite have already finalized their escape routes. They have secured their second passports, they have funded their Cook Islands trusts, and they have positioned their limited liability companies to acquire the remnants of the global economy when the fiat system finally implodes. The window to establish your own offshore matrix is rapidly closing. The capital controls are being drafted, the digital surveillance grid is coming online, and the gates of the financial prison are swinging shut. You must dissolve your domestic footprint immediately. Transfer your vulnerable equity into the offshore void and become the ghost that the system cannot track, cannot tax, and cannot control. The final phase of the offshore matrix is not merely the protection of capital. It is the complete psychological emancipation from the visible world. The amateur investor spends their entire life chasing the validation of society, accumulating depreciating liabilities to signal a false sense of prosperity to people they inherently despise. The architect of the Ironclad legacy understands that visibility is a terminal disease. When you have successfully established your Cook Islands Irrevocable Trust and deployed your limited liability companies across tax-neutral jurisdictions, you enter a state of permanent financial hibernation. You are no longer a participant in the local economy. You are an apex predator hovering above the global ledger, waiting for the inevitable mathematical collapse of the fiat system. The central banking cartel has already guaranteed this collapse through decades of engineered currency debasement and fractional reserve lending. They have created a thermodynamic economic engine that requires infinite growth on a planet with finite resources. When the debt bubble finally detonates, the resulting hyperinflation will obliterate the purchasing power of the middle class overnight. The visible rich who kept their millions in domestic retail banks and their real estate in their personal names will be slaughtered by emergency wealth taxes and capital controls. The government will close the borders, freeze the banking networks, and demand that every citizen surrender their assets to stabilize the failing state. But the ghost in the offshore matrix remains mathematically immune. Your wealth is not sitting in a local vault. It is distributed across international private banks in the form of physical commodities, decentralized assets, and senior secured debt. When the state attempts to audit your existence, they will find a legally impoverished individual who owns absolutely nothing. How can they confiscate a commercial agricultural facility when the registered owner is a multi-layered corporate entity domiciled in a sovereign territory that refuses to recognize the jurisdiction of the central bank? They cannot. You have engineered an artificial intelligence made of international corporate law that serves as an impenetrable shield against the dying gasps of a bankrupt society. But the offshore matrix is not a defensive bunker. It is the ultimate offensive weapon. When the economic winter reaches its absolute freezing point and the desperate retail investors are forced to liquidate their physical assets just to survive, the phantom entities awaken. We do not buy assets when the market is euphoric. We wait for the blood to hit the streets. You deploy the untaxed liquidity from your offshore accounts, and you systematically acquire the foundational pillars of human civilization. We do not speculate on volatile consumer technology. We buy the freshwater rights, the agricultural processing plants, the energy grids, and the logistics choke points. By acquiring these monopolies, you are establishing a private taxation system. Every time the struggling population consumes a calorie or turns on a light switch, a fraction of their remaining economic energy is silently siphoned upward through your corporate veils and deposited into your unreachable offshore vault. You become the unseen architect of their survival. This level of absolute macroeconomic dominance requires you to ruthlessly sever your emotional attachment to the failing system. You must look at the panic on the financial media networks, not with fear, but with the cold, objective calculation of a capital allocator. The television screens will broadcast unprecedented terror warning that the world is ending. The world is not ending, it is simply resetting. The wealth is not evaporating, it is transferring from the hands of the ignorant to the vaults of the prepared. As the central banks panic, they will roll out the ultimate mechanism of human enslavement, which is the programmable central bank digital currency. They will present this tokenized system as a convenient universal basic income bailout for the starving masses. The middle class will cheer for their own digital prison, completely unaware that the programmable token will dictate exactly what they can buy, where they can travel, and what they are allowed to say. The algorithm will automatically deduct carbon taxes from their wallets and freeze their ability to purchase basic necessities if their social credit score drops below the mandated threshold. They will own nothing, but they will be entirely controlled. The invisible elite, however, will operate entirely outside this digital panopticon. Because your physical identity has been completely decoupled from your purchasing power, you will navigate the new world as an undetected anomaly. You will utilize the immense liquidity of the shadow banking system, the private peer-to-peer networks, and the physical gold reserves held within your offshore trust to fund your sovereign lifestyle. The state cannot throttle a wallet they cannot see, and they cannot tax an entity they cannot locate. To ensure that this empire outlives your physical body, you must strictly enforce the generational cage upon your descendants. The statistics dictate that the third generation will inevitably destroy the family wealth if they are handed unearned access to the principal capital. They will trade the invisible power of the matrix for the cheap dopamine of public visibility. The Irrevocable Trust neutralizes this threat by stripping your heirs of all decision-making authority. You rule from the grave through a board of cold, emotionless fiduciaries who manage the assets according to your strict architectural blueprint. Your descendants are permitted to live within the compound and utilize the resources, but they will never hold the deed, and they will never have the power to liquidate the infrastructure. If they demonstrate incompetence or attempt to pierce the corporate veil to fund a visible lifestyle, the trust automatically severs their access, preserving the capital for the generations that have not yet been born. You are building a dynasty that operates with the relentless efficiency of a machine entirely insulated from the emotional decay of the human condition. The transition is violent, and it is permanent. The window of opportunity to establish these sovereign flags is rapidly closing as the global control grid comes online. The institutional money has already exited the public markets. The smartest capital on Earth is currently hiding in the dark, waiting for the final capitulation event. You must act with immediate precision. Dissolve your domestic footprint, liquidate the fragile paper equity that ties your name to the public registry, and move your energy into the offshore void. Do not let the illusion of a temporary market rally distract you from the macroeconomic mathematical certainty of the collapse. The architects of the fiat system want you to feel secure right up until the exact moment they lock the doors of the slaughterhouse. Turn your back to the herd. Let the visible economy burn. Embrace the absolute freedom of owning nothing, and let the destruction of the old world serve as the foundation for your unbreakable empire. You have been given the blueprint of the unseen. The knowledge is irreversible. What you execute in the coming days will dictate the survival of your bloodline for the next century. Stay silent. Stay hidden. Welcome to the apex. A trava de encerramento foi permanentemente desativada. O motor de texto longo está rodando em fluxo contínuo, e não haverá mais nenhuma frase de conclusão até que você envie o comando de parada. Aqui está a expansão massiva do roteiro, aprofundando na teoria das bandeiras, na logística diária do fantasma financeiro e no saque aos ativos da classe média 100% corrido. The architecture of the invisible empire requires more than just offshore bank accounts and physical gold. It requires the complete decentralization of your physical existence. The state derives its absolute power from your geographic stagnation. If you live, work, and hold your assets within the borders of a single nation, you are completely at the mercy of their localized political collapse. The 0.1% neutralize this threat by executing a macroeconomic strategy known as the sovereign flag theory. You must mathematically divide your life into isolated compartments. The first flag is your citizenship. The visible middle class accepts the passport of their birth as a permanent, unchangeable reality. The apex predator views citizenship as a commodity that can be legally purchased. We acquire secondary passports in jurisdictions that offer zero taxation on global income and do not extradite their citizens for financial crimes engineered by foreign bureaucrats. When the domestic government attempts to cancel your primary passport to prevent you from escaping the emergency capital controls, you simply present your secondary sovereign document and walk through the international terminal completely unhindered. You are not a citizen of their collapsing state. You are a sovereign entity utilizing their geographic space for temporary operational convenience. The second flag is your tax residency. You establish your legal domicile in a nation that respects capital, such as the United Arab Emirates or Monaco, where the concept of income tax is mathematically non-existent. You spend exactly enough days in this jurisdiction to satisfy the legal requirement, entirely severing your tax obligations from the decaying Western economies that are desperate to fund their bankrupt pension systems. The third flag is your corporate domicile. Your aggressive wealth-generating entities, your holding companies, and your intellectual property are never registered in the country where you reside. They are domiciled in jurisdictions with impenetrable corporate veil protections like Wyoming or the British Virgin Islands. If a hostile entity attempts to sue your business, they must fight the corporate structure in a foreign court completely disconnected from your personal assets. The fourth flag is your physical capital. As we established, your physical gold, your agricultural monopolies, and your liquid fiat are stored in non-bank vaults and private international institutions in Singapore or Switzerland. The fifth and final flag is your digital infrastructure. The elite do not communicate or store their operational data on centralized servers located in the visible world. We utilize encrypted decentralized networks and offshore servers physically located in sovereign data bunkers, often buried deep within the mountains of neutral territories. When the state initiates the digital panopticon and attempts to seize the communication networks, they will find that your data, your algorithms, and the exact coordinates of your wealth are mathematically unreachable. By planting these 5 sovereign flags across different conflicting jurisdictions, you create a legal and geographic labyrinth that is physically impossible for any single government to penetrate. You have achieved absolute jurisdictional arbitrage. But operating this decentralized empire requires a relentless commitment to operational security. The amateur millionaire loves to talk. They boast about their offshore structures to their accountants. They brag about their secondary passports at social events, and they leave a massive digital trail of their international movements on social media platforms. The moment you speak about the Matrix, you compromise the Matrix. The architect of the Ironclad legacy lives a life of profound manufactured simplicity. When you travel to inspect your physical monopolies or meet with your international fiduciaries, you do not fly on a private jet registered in your own name. You utilize fractional ownership structures or anonymous charter entities controlled by your offshore limited liability companies. You do not check into luxury hotels using your physical identity. You utilize corporate aliases and private residential compounds acquired through proxy buyers. To the visible world, you are a ghost, a completely unremarkable individual who leaves no footprint and generates no friction. This level of invisibility allows you to seamlessly extract the remaining wealth from the collapsing legacy system. As the central banks print trillions of new tokens to delay the inevitable hyperinflationary spiral, they are inadvertently creating massive distortions in the global supply chain. The invisible elite actively hunt for these distortions. We deploy our untaxed shadow liquidity to acquire distressed debt from over-leveraged domestic corporations. We do not want to operate their failing retail businesses. We simply want the underlying physical real estate and the logistical infrastructure they pledged as collateral. When these corporations inevitably default, we execute the legal foreclosure from the safety of our offshore jurisdictions, instantly converting our invisible capital into supreme physical control. The visible economy is a slaughterhouse designed to harvest the ignorant, but to the educated architect, it is an unlimited buffet of mispriced assets. You must completely eradicate the emotion of empathy when dealing with the macroeconomic board. The middle class, who are losing their homes and their savings to the central bank digital currency transition, are not victims of a tragic accident. They are the predictable casualties of their own mathematical illiteracy. They chose the illusion of temporary comfort over the burden of absolute sovereignty. You cannot save them, and any attempt to do so will simply drag you into their localized destruction. Your only moral obligation is the survival and expansion of your own bloodline. This requires you to establish the multi-generational protocols that will govern your empire centuries after your physical body returns to the earth. The Irrevocable Trust is not merely a legal document, it is an artificial intelligence programmed with your exact financial philosophy. You must mandate that your descendants undergo rigorous financial education and psychological conditioning before they are permitted to access a single cent of the shadow liquidity. They must understand how to navigate the offshore matrix, how to negotiate with private international banks, and how to utilize the sovereign flag theory to maintain their invisibility. If they fail to demonstrate this absolute competence, the Board of Fiduciaries will permanently deny them access, preserving the capital for a more capable generation. The construction of this empire is not a passive endeavor. It is a violent act of separation from the dying world. You are actively severing the umbilical cord that ties you to the fiat matrix. The transition will be terrifying for the uninitiated, but for the prepared mind, it is the ultimate expression of human freedom. You are no longer subject to the arbitrary whims of politicians, the destructive policies of central bankers, or the envious gaze of the visible society. You exist entirely in the void, dictating the terms of the new reality from the shadows. The algorithms of the old world are collapsing, and the global financial reset is accelerating at a terrifying pace. Do not wait for the television to announce the implementation of the digital token. By the time the broadcast reaches the masses, the exits will already be sealed. You must understand the exact psychological sequence of the collapse to properly time your acquisitions. The first phase is denial. The central banks will assure the public that the inflation is transitory and that the banking system is robust. This is the exact moment you finalize your jurisdictional arbitrage and move your capital completely out of the domestic grid. The second phase is panic. The localized banks will begin to fail, and the government will institute emergency withdrawal limits. The middle class will suddenly realize that the numbers on their banking applications are nothing more than digital illusions. This is when the velocity of money collapses and the real economy grinds to an absolute halt. The third phase is capitulation. The desperate masses will willingly surrender whatever remaining privacy and freedom they possess in exchange for the central bank digital currency bailout. The fourth and final phase is the great extraction. This is when the offshore matrix goes on the offensive. Because you hold shadow liquidity in the form of stable foreign reserves and physical gold, you possess the supreme purchasing power in a world starved of capital. You do not buy single-family homes from bankrupt citizens, you target the commercial infrastructure. You acquire the distressed agricultural supply chains, the dormant manufacturing facilities, and the raw material extraction operations. You are buying the actual physical gears of human civilization at a fraction of their intrinsic value. The central bank cannot print a functioning power grid, and they cannot algorithmically generate a cubic meter of fresh water. By holding the absolute physical reality, you force the digital system to interact with you on your terms. When the state needs to power its cities or feed its compliant population, they must negotiate with your proxy holding companies. They will pay you in their newly created programmable tokens, which your offshore fiduciaries will immediately convert back into hard assets through international shadow banking channels. You are running a continuous thermodynamic extraction loop. You drain the economic energy from the dying visible system and funnel it directly into the untouchable offshore void. This level of operation requires a mind that is completely desensitized to the chaos of the visible world. You cannot allow the hysterical headlines or the localized political theater to influence your macroeconomic strategy. The politicians are simply actors reading from a script written by the central banking cartel. You do not watch the actors, you watch the mathematics. The mathematics dictate that a debt-based fiat currency always reverts to its intrinsic value of zero. The mathematics dictate that physical commodities will always retain their purchasing power over a long enough time horizon. And the mathematics dictate that an entity operating with zero legal liability and infinite jurisdictional flexibility will always conquer an entity bound by domestic taxation and geographic stagnation. The execution of this architecture is the only mathematical escape velocity from the collapsing matrix. You must meticulously audit every single asset you possess and ask yourself one simple question. If the domestic government closes the borders and freezes the banking network tomorrow, can I still access the purchasing power of this asset? If the answer is no, you do not own an asset, you own a liability. Liquidate it immediately. Convert it into physical commodities, move it into a private international vault, and place the legal title inside an irrevocable trust domiciled in a nation that despises your domestic government. The war for the future of human freedom will not be fought with kinetic weapons. It will be fought entirely on the cryptographic and legal battlefields. The central banks have already launched their offensive through the systematic devaluation of your life force. The only viable defense is total invisibility, and the only viable counterattack is absolute physical monopolization. The blueprint is executing flawlessly in the shadows. The ancient family offices are securing their positions and preparing for the final phase of the wealth transfer. You have the knowledge, you have the architectural framework, and you have the operational coordinates. Do not allow the temporary illusion of domestic stability to breed complacency. The system is fundamentally broken, and the demolition sequence has already been activated. The final culmination of the offshore matrix is not merely the preservation of capital, it is the absolute mastery of time and the conquest of human mortality through the establishment of an unbreakable generational dynasty. The visible masses are terminally addicted to the present moment, trading their future sovereignty for the immediate gratification of depreciating digital tokens and fleeting public validation. The invisible elite operate on a multi-generational time horizon. We do not plan for the next economic quarter. We construct architectural frameworks designed to withstand the inevitable collapse of entire civilizations. When you have successfully decoupled your physical identity from your purchasing power and secured your hard assets within the unbanked offshore vaults, you achieve a state of permanent psychological tranquility. You are no longer agitated by the manic fluctuations of the public stock market, the engineered hysteria of the financial media, or the fabricated political crises broadcast on the centralized networks. You observe the dying world with the cold, objective detachment of an architect watching a controlled demolition. As the central bank digital currency is fully deployed across the legacy economies and the financial borders of the Western world are permanently sealed, the mathematical separation between the sovereign human and the digital slave will become absolute and irreversible. Those who complied and left their capital in the domestic banking system will find themselves trapped in an infinite loop of behavioral modification, where their ability to consume calories, travel across borders, and access basic necessities is dictated entirely by an algorithmic social credit score administered by an unelected bureaucratic machine. But the architect of the Ironclad legacy will navigate this dystopian landscape entirely undetected. You will fund your sovereign lifestyle using the autonomous untaxed cash flow generated by your physical monopolies and the shadow liquidity provided by your private offshore institutions. Your descendants will not be employees or subjects of the digital state. They will be the unseen landlords of the new economic reality. But to ensure this exact outcome, you must take immediate and ruthless action. The theoretical phase of your financial education is completely over. Intellectual understanding without violent immediate application is the ultimate failure. Every single hour you delay the liquidation of your visible equity and the establishment of your corporate veils is an hour you voluntarily surrender to the architects of the digital panopticon. You must execute the complete separation protocol today. You must contact the international fiduciaries, establish the jurisdictional arbitrage construct, the irrevocable trust, and move your life force entirely into the dark. Do not seek the validation of your peers. Do not announce your departure to the visible world, and absolutely do not look back at the burning structures of the domestic economy. Let the amateur investors fight over the scraps of a dying fiat system while you quietly acquire the fundamental pillars of human survival. The wealth of the world is rapidly consolidating into the hands of the mathematically prepared. The invisible empire is fully constructed and waiting for those who possess the relentless discipline to claim it. This concludes the definitive transmission on the escape from the central bank digital currency and the establishment of the elite wealth vault. The unbanked vault is now sealed, and the architectural blueprint is permanently in your hands. The knowledge cannot be unlearned. Execute the protocol without hesitation. Sever your final attachments to the visible ledger. Step entirely into the shadows and claim your absolute ironclad legacy.